All right, we are in Revelation chapter 5 tonight. We covered, I think, through about verse 8 last week. And so we need to finish up chapter 5 and go on to chapter 6. In chapter 5, though, remember that the theme could be summarized in the words, "Worthy is the Lamb." This is the introduction of the Christ, the one who is worthy to open the sealed book. He comes to the Lord himself, to God the Father, and takes the book unhesitatingly. He is the resurrected Lamb, the one who stands and continues to stand. And as he takes the book, then the host of heaven praises him and rejoices that someone is worthy to take the book and to break the seals, to open the seals. Now, a couple of notes in that respect. Do remember that the scroll in God's hand is not the nature of it, the point of it is not described to us at this point. It could be God's eternal purpose for human salvation, for example. What is the information here? That would seem likely. That was Homer Haley's suggestion on the subject. Another possibility is some would say, well, this is God's will for the immediate future. And that has been the interpretation of many Protestant commentators through the years, that this is God's immediate future intentions and so forth. There's a problem with that in that some of what we're going to see appears to be historical rather than future in nature. But the gist, the point to remember here is that what's in the book is God's will. When the seals are broken, God's will is revealed, carried out, brought to fruition. Now, I want to notice something about verse 8 in chapter 5. In verse 8, when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lord, each holding a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And our friends in the Protestant world, particularly, Catholicism as well, though they tend not to defend their beliefs, they just state their beliefs as if you ought to just go along with them. But our friends in the Protestant world will sometimes appeal to this passage to say, see, here is the justification for the use of instruments. The 24 elders have harps. There are going to be harps in heaven, so why shouldn't there be harps in our worship today? And so forth.
And as West says, then bring on the horses.
Well, yeah, exactly. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. If this is literal, why not everything else? Now, advocates of instrumental music, of the use of instruments in worship, will pretty well freely admit that basically everything else here is figurative. Why not this? Well, when you have an agenda, when you're trying to prove something that you have for which you have no other evidence, then anything becomes fair game. Notice that the passage here does not say John heard many waters. What did he hear? He heard a voice as of many waters in this context, in this chapter. He heard something that sounded like. The point is that this doesn't speak top, side, nor bottom to the use of instruments in worship. Go on, they sang a new song. Now, that new song in verse 9, that's really kind of where we need to pick up here. They sang a new song. What's new about it? Well, the New Testament typically uses two distinct words that are translated by our English word new. One of those would be very familiar to us just from common use, neos or neos. We talk about neoconservatives and neo-progressives, meaning a new variety or a reincarnation, a rebranding of something, meaning something that is new in terms of time. The neo, anything that is a neophyte, for instance, is something that is brand new. It's not existed before, or it's a new iteration of something. The other Greek word is the word pardon me, kainos. If you want to spell it out, it would be Kainos, and that refers to new in quality or new in character. And kainos is the word that is always used through the book of Revelation to describe something new. It's not that this is a new thing that God has created that has never existed before. It's a new point in time. That's not it at all. This is something that's new in character, new in quality. It's new or unique in that respect. And so they sing a new song, verse 9. That is a song of praise, a song that has not been that has not extolled these aspects up until this point. Jesus died on the cross. He purchased salvation for all humanity. He is raised from the dead, establishing his kingdom, his church. He reigns at the Father's right hand. He offers salvation to all, but he forces it on no one. Notice in verse 9, though, as we go along, they sang a new song saying, "Worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals. For you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation." And verse 10, "You've made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on the earth." You've redeemed us to God. You've purchased us back, ransomed us, as it were. And who all is ransomed? People of every nation, tribe. This redemption is total. There's no half measure to what God has done in Jesus Christ, and it knows no boundaries. It's not restricted to race or boundary or language or time. The redemption is for all who are willing to submit to God. And then in verse 10, you have made us kings and priests, or a kingdom and priests. Why the difference between kings and priests? Well, that's a manuscript difference in the Greek texts. Different manuscripts say kings and kingdoms. There is not a material doctrinal difference between the two. We are a kingdom of priests, a kingdom ruled by our king. We are priests as Christians, as children of God. Jesus rules at the Father's right hand from the time that he ascended until today. Whether we are kings or a kingdom makes no difference in terms of our relationship to him. So then we go on. I looked, I heard around the throne and the living creatures and the elders the voice of many angels, myriads of myriads, thousands of thousands, a huge number, an uncountable number, basically. And so here we have a redemption theme about to be presented. We have a new song, suggestive perhaps of a new beginning with God. That is, those who are on God's side are in a righteous condition. We've been redeemed. We have a new beginning with him. We're redeemed for God's glory. We're redeemed through the Son's blood. The scope of that redemption is unlimited. The redeemed are citizens of his kingdom. And then this statement, we shall reign. You have redeemed us. You've made us to be a kingdom. We shall reign on the earth. Now, notice the future tense, a future condition, not necessarily a specific point in time, but a future quality. And then innumerable hosts of living creatures, elders, angels, an uncountable number, power and wisdom and so forth. What?
Question on
Okay,
the idea that shall is future.
okay,
I take it as one of two ways, either future or absolute.
certainty, okay.
You know,
An element of certainty, that certainly applies as well, because what are we talking about?
but not necessarily future, but it could have been now and forever.
Okay. Possibility, certainly, but shall, an element of certainty, that is, this is a done deal. Now, they shall reign. Worthy is the Lamb, verse 12. The praise from the elders, the angels, all of these qualities speaking of the Lamb, riches, strength, honor, glory, blessing. You go to chapter 7, verses 10 through 12, and you have a similar event or a similar, lost the word I'm looking for, a similar statement of praise. There's a word I'm looking for, and it's just disappeared into the ether. But you have a similar situation there in chapter 7 as well. In all of this, the focus is on the one who is worthy to take the scroll. Now, notice in verses 13 and 14, praise comes from all created beings, every creature in heaven, on earth, under the earth. We touched on that idea earlier last week, but I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and in the sea and all that is in them saying, to him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing and honor and glory and might forever and ever. And the four living creatures said, Amen. And the elders fell down and worshiped. So all created things. Now that's thought is similar to what's expressed in Exodus 20 and verse 11 concerning the response of the created or the creation to the Creator. When all creation functions as God has ordained, as God designed, what's the net result? God is glorified. God receives the honor, the glory that is due to him. Now, who is being praised here?
Who's on the throne?
Okay, God the Father, but who's there with him? God the Son, God the Spirit. Deity receives the worship of all the heavenly hosts. Notice, this is not just from an earthly realm, not just humanity and all the things that we see on this earth. Who else is included? Oh, thank you, sir. Just set this right here. I won't forget that. But who else is included? All the heavenly beings. Now, what kind of beings are in heaven? In the heavenly realm? What do we know about? Well, we know about angels, and we know that there's seemingly, according to the scriptures, there's more than one, what would you call it? One category, one type, one class of angels. We read about cherubim and seraphim, and the differences are evidently there are differences. The details of the differences are not necessarily distinct for us. We can see some things. Is there a difference in their roles, their responsibilities, their activities? I have not the foggiest idea. But what should stand out to us here is that even those heavenly beings are participating in the praise of God, in the worship of God. They are not receiving worship or praise. Go back to the book of Ezekiel, for example, and you find Ezekiel at times receiving revelation, speaking with an angel of God. And what is Ezekiel's almost default response to the overwhelming image of an angel? To fall down and worship. And every time, what is he told? Oh, don't you do that. Get up. Worship God, not me. And yet, What do we have? Now, in this Western culture, we tend to relate to the Roman Catholic practices, but we find likewise to some degree among Lutheran and Episcopalian or Anglican, and in Eastern Europe, some segments of the Orthodox denominations likewise following in this pattern of venerating heavenly beings less than God, venerating angels, worshiping angels. And yet there is no biblical precedent for that, and abundant biblical precedent that would prohibit that. So, in verse 14, then the living creatures fell down and said, Amen. The elders fell down and worshiped, and all is going in this image that John sees. All is going as God designed it to go. Everything works as it should. So that brings us to Revelation chapter 6. And in Revelation chapter 6, the seals of the scroll, the seals of the book, begin to be opened. Now, what are we going to learn as these seals are opened? Well, there's a lot of stuff going to happen, as John says. But beyond that, this is an echo of what Jesus had told some of the churches in those letters in chapters 2 and 3. Think about the letter to the church at Smyrna in chapter 2. What's the most familiar passage to us out of Revelation chapter 2 for many of us? Which verse? Verse 10. Be faithful unto death, and I'll give you the crown of life. But that's not all that it says. What else does it say? What else does Jesus tell those Christians at Smyrna? Some of you are going to have tribulation for 10 days. You'll be cast into prison. You'll have hard times. Well, guess what? The seals in chapter 6 are going to begin to reveal. Hard times are coming. Tribulation is coming. Now, tribulation is coming, but not in the sense that John Hagee or Tim LaHaye or some of those guys want to present it, not in the sense that Hal Lindsey would present it in a political sense for the 21st century, or in their earlier writings, the 20th century. Tribulation in the world compared victory in Jesus. What did Jesus tell his disciples in John 16, verse 33? In the world, you have tribulation, you have trials, but be of good cheer. Why? I've overcome the world. I have overcome the world. So if chapters 4 and 5 are the centerpiece, the hub around which the book of Revelation revolves, that would make chapter 6, in a sense, the beginning of the end. Everything from chapter 6 to chapter 22 is a series of explanations or revelations, if you will, of the basic message in chapters 4 and 5. What's the basic message in chapters 4 and 5? In a word, perspective. Worthy is the Lamb. In fact, that's what Dr. Ray Summers entitled his commentary on the book of Revelation, Worthy is the Lamb. So we come here and we see the seals begin to be opened, and then trumpets sounding, and then bowls being poured out, and so forth as we go forward. And chapter 6 shows us what's about to be revealed in chapters 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. Now, two basic interpretations of these symbols are going to be offered in the class notes that you see here that you should have. One corresponds to what you might call the immediate application of these things, the immediate application perspective. In other words, these symbols identify events, specific events that are happening or about to happen at the time that John is writing. That's one perspective, and we'll talk about that as we go along. Remember, I had said just a minute ago that you have 2 points of view relating to this, that there is a historical view which has to do with events right then and so forth, and then there's a different perspective as well. That second perspective, that is an ongoing application, if you will. How does Revelation relate? If the immediate application perspective is correct, then who does this book benefit? Who does this writing benefit most of all?
First century.
Well, exactly. First century folks living right then that are about to experience all of these things. If that's the case, then what's it for us? It would essentially be not much more than just sort of a curious historical document in a lot of respects. We might be able to look at it and say, okay, well, we can see where this and this and this and this is fulfilled, but that's in the past. It's, think of the Lion King and Rafiki whacking him on the head. What'd you do that for? What does it matter? It's in the past. Well, that would be a maybe not a very respectful perspective, but that would be an understandable perspective for Christians today, if that's the only real application here. But the other perspective that we'll want to touch on and look at is what you might call an ongoing application, or some would call it a philosophy of history perspective, which says John is seeing here in these chapters 6 through 22 what you might call a repeating cycle of events in the history of the church, in the end days of God's relationship with humanity on earth, that culminate in the final judgment. Well, you had a comment, Brother Ray?
Quick question.
Okay.
Now, I've asked you this before, because sometimes I see in the Old Testament, people say there's immediate application, but sometimes in messianic passages, sometimes I don't see it, but you explained to me Isaiah
53, yeah.
Let me ask you about Daniel's the statue. Does that have
the image of that Nebuchadnezzar saw? Okay.
Yeah. Does that have immediate application? It seems like every time I hear anyone talk about it, it's always talked about in terms of future applications.
Well,
I just wonder, is there any immediate context there?
The immediate context from Nebuchadnezzar's perspective would be what Daniel said to him. That is, O great king, the God of heaven has shown you what is to be. So from Nebuchadnezzar's point of view, what does he learn from this? My kingdom is great. My empire is mighty, and it will last for a period of time, which what's the normal experience in history? Every kingdom rises and eventually what?
Falls.
Eventually falls. Well, Nebuchadnezzar would be he would be an egotist on the par with Adolf Hitler if he thought his kingdom was never going to fall. But in his experience, it's not going to happen in his days. It's not going to happen in his son's days. It's way on down the road from his perspective. So for Nebuchadnezzar, as far as personal application, there's an immediate personal application of sorts. It's an element of assurance that the God who rules all things is going to preserve him and his kingdom, at least for a period of time. From an egotistical standpoint, the empire that would arise, the kingdom that would arise after that, which would be the Medo-Persians, golden head, that's Nebuchadnezzar, silver breast and chest, that's the Medo-Persians. That's they're stronger, but they're not as brilliant. They're not as glorious, rich, what have you. They're succeeded by Alexander the Great and the Greeks, and they're the belly of brass. Well, that's harder, more durable still in some respects. It's interesting to notice that each successive empire lasts longer, even though in respect of who rules and so forth, each one in a sense is less glorious. It's more durable, it lasts longer, but it's less glorious than the one before it. So you've got the golden head. How long does the Babylonian Empire actually last? Actually, about less than 100 years, really. About 80 years. You get from about 620 down to about 539 BC. So it lasts 3 generations from, or 4 generations from Nebuchadnezzar's father, whose name, if memory serves me, was Nabopolassar, through Nebuchadnezzar, who was really the progenitor of the great empire, and his son, who was not much. And then we get down to Belshazzar, his grandson, who is actually the ruler at the time that the empire falls. So you've got roughly 79, 80 years of empire, and then it's gone. Now, historians have described the Babylonian Empire in curious terms, because the Assyrians that came before them lasted longer. And Babylon was a client state, a province of the Assyrians, and then they sort of consumed the Assyrian Empire from within. But from a historical, political point of view, taking God out of the picture, there's no logical political reason for the Babylonian Empire to exist. It should have, from a political standpoint, from a machinations on the world stage point of view, it should have just gone from the Assyrians and flowed into the Medo-Persians. And yet here's the Babylonian Empire that just streaks across the sky of history like a meteorite or a falling star or something. Just lights up the sky brilliantly for just a flash historically, and is gone, to be replaced by the Medo-Persians. Well, the Medo-Persian Empire lasts, roughly speaking, about 200 years, a little more than 200 years, to be replaced by Alexander the Great. Alexander, of course, Alexander doesn't live all that long, but his empire is the mightiest of that ancient era, certainly controls the most territory up to that point. And even though Alexander dies, the influence of his empire lasts from about the mid-4th century, approximately 340 BC, all the way down to the 1st century BC. Now, do they uniformly control things? No, because the empire splits into factions after Alexander's death, but they're still all Greeks, and they're still all influential. And it's not until the middle of the 1st century BC that we see the Iron Kingdom, the Romans, begin to rise. And of course, they will last longer than all of the others put together as an empire. All from Nebuchadnezzar forward, they'll last longer than the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, and the Greeks combined as an empire. But what do we see? Iron and iron mingled with clay. As the farther they go, the more fragmented they become, the more diverse they become, not in the political sense, but just culturally, ethnically, philosophically, religiously, even politically, they become more diverse. And so hundreds of years after the establishment of the Roman Empire, what happens? You've got this polyglot remnant of the empire that finally falls apart when the Franks invade, and the Goths and so forth from Eastern Europe. Well, what does Nebuchadnezzar take out of all of this? I got a great kingdom, and effectively, at least in my lifetime, I got nothing to worry about. Now, you weren't really looking for a 5-minute excursion on all of that. But here, as we look at the rest of the Revelation, one of the things my friend Jim Beverly made this point in teaching about this, and it's an excellent point, something to keep in mind. We need to realize we don't know everything. that we might want to know in the revelation. There are several things in the revelation that God does not explain to us in detail. And we come to those things, we go, I'll scratch my head. What about? And so, okay, well, let's hold that thought and keep going and see if God explains that. And we'll get to the end of the revelation, and there will still be a few things that God does not explain in great detail for us.
We told him not to write some of this stuff down.
Exactly. Some things God does not allow John to reveal. Some things God does not give us details about. And, you know, it's helpful as young people. What did Daddy teach you? Daddy taught you everything you know. Daddy didn't teach you everything he knows. Well, there's a passage in the Bible that sort of corresponds to that. You go back to Deuteronomy chapter 29, and what do we read in Deuteronomy 29 and verse 29? Well, the secret things belong to God. In other words, there's some things God hasn't told us. But that's not all that passage says. A lot of times when brethren will come to some conundrum in the scriptures, I can't figure that out. I don't understand that. That must be one of those Deuteronomy 29 things. The secret things belong to God, and they just dismiss it and move on, and they miss the rest of the passage. Because the rest of the passage says, but the things that are revealed belong unto the sons of men, or words to that effect. In other words, God is basically saying, I've told you everything you need to know. I didn't tell you everything I know, but I've told you everything you need to know. So get busy and know it. Well, realize we don't know everything. There are several things in the revelation that God does not reveal completely. For example, we're about to talk about horsemen in chapter 6. Well, who are these horsemen? I can offer you several different interpretations of them.
We need one to Hell Rider horseman with Step and Hell.
Okay, but
Who is Step and Hell?
we'll come back to that. In one sense, like I said a while ago, chapter 6 marks the beginning of the end of the book. The gist of the whole book is going to be summarized when the seventh seal is opened. What does the seventh seal do? It introduces 7 trumpets. 7 trumpets then direct our attention to 7 bowls. Think of it, when I was studying homiletics as a student in Bible school, we were taught something called Barnes' Basic Outline. And when you outline your thoughts for a sermon or a Bible class, well, your first main point is Roman numeral number 1. But then you're going to have points that relate to that are not the main point. They're sub points of it. So now you have point A and point B, and maybe then you have points that relate to that, but they're not the main point and they're not the primary sub points. So they're point 1 and point 2. And maybe you even go farther than that and you have little letter A and little letter B and so forth. And the point is that all of these things relate back up to point number 1. And then when you get finished with that, where do you go? Well, you come down here to Roman numeral number 2, and there's your second main point. Well, in these seals and trumpets and bowls, you have something that could be read as an approximation of this kind of organization. Well, you have here the basic pattern of everything we're going to read in the rest of the Revelation. Now, it's not ironclad in that respect. Talking about the things that we're about to see. Start at chapter 6 and verse 1. I watched when the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures say with a voice like thunder, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him. And he came out conquering and to conquer. Now, the seal keeps something closed, concealed. Breaking the seals exposes that. More information is provided. Now, these symbols are introduced or explained. They're introduced in concept by the beasts that we just saw in chapter 5 and verse 14. Come and see, or come. It's the same response that Jesus gave to the disciples in John chapter 1, verse 39. That was the response that Andrew gave to Peter when he was skeptical about what Andrew said about Jesus. Come and see. So we have the imagery here, symbolism, the white horse. Now go back to Zechariah for a minute in the Old Testament, to chapter 1. Zechariah chapter 1, and parallel to that is in Zechariah chapter 6. But in Zechariah chapter 1 and verse 8, if you can't find Zechariah, it comes right after Zephaniah and Haggai. So you find Zephaniah, and then you find Haggai, and then it comes to Zechariah. Minor prophets right at the end of the Old Testament. So in Zechariah chapter 1, at verse 7, on the 24th day of the 11th month, which is the month of Shabbat, in the second year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, son of Iddo, saying, I saw in the night, behold, a man riding on a red horse. And he was standing among the myrtle trees in the glen, and behind him were red and sorrel and white horses. So you've got a parallel to this idea of riders on horses. Come over to Zechariah chapter 6, and you start at verse 1. Again, I lifted my eyes and saw, and behold, 4 chariots came out from between 2 mountains. The mountains were mountains of bronze. The first chariot had red horses, the second black horses, the third white horses, the fourth chariot dappled horses, all of them strong. And he goes on. Well, what's the significance of this? John is drawing from imagery in the Old Testament. By inspiration, John is drawing from Old Testament imagery that would be familiar to students of the Old Testament. Is the identification of these things exactly the same as it was 500, 600, 700 years before? No, not necessarily so. But here you have symbolism that would be reminiscent or familiar in that context. So you have, by the way, similar judgments also in Ezekiel chapter 5. The instruction here, come, that's spoken to the horse and the rider, not to John. Now, Brother Robert Taylor speculates that the rider we see here is, in fact, the Savior, Jesus, because of the color, white horse, and the appearance, the purpose. He has a bow. He's given a crown. He is sent to conquer. And if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense. Now, that also happens to be the perspective that Brother Homer Haley brings to this, the going forth of Christ in the gospel. Now, Tim LaHaye, dispensationalist, premillennialist, the guy behind the Left Behind series of books and one of the production people for the Chosen series that's now being aired on TV. LaHaye, who is noted for his attempts to try to make all of these things apply to the current time and the current political circumstances, LaHaye says, oh, that's the Antichrist who's going to destroy Russia. Except that LaHaye's perspective is it may be undergoing a little renaissance for the moment because of Putin in Ukraine, but it's going to have to shift because Putin's not really all that strong on the world stage. Who's the great strong man on the world stage now besides the United States? That would be China. And right behind China, who's the rising pervasive irritant influence in politics? That would be the Islamic world. So LaHaye's perspective is going to have to undergo some rapid changes if things continue the way they are. And it wouldn't be the first time that's happened. Well, Jim McGuigan, one of our brethren who's now gone on, McGuigan likewise says the first rider is the Christ, and then goes on to interpret the other images as well. It's interesting that the Jehovah's Witnesses, in their writings, their perspective is exactly like that of Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins and Hal Lindsey and John Hagee and those guys, except according to their chronology, all of these events take place in 1914. Well, what happened, according to the witnesses, what happened in 1914? Well, the Lord returned, but secretly and invisibly. And according to their theology, that's when God's kingdom was established.
Well, it's Jerry Rice. You talking? I mean, with Jerry Jenkins. You talking the one who's a member of the?
No, he's not a brother.
Okay.
Jerry B. Jenkins is his. Not any of the Jenkins family amongst our brethren. No relation to Dan or Dale or Jeff or any of those guys.
Yeah, I think that Jerry Jenkins is a part of the anti-group.
Farrell Jenkins. Farrell Jenkins, not Jerry Jenkins. No, Jerry B. Jenkins, if memory serves me. He is a co-writer with Tim LaHaye on a whole lot of those books that have been so popular.
Standing with the idea that this revelation was written for first century Christians and all the rest of us.
Right.
I see the possibility you can interpret it that they could be talking about something that's happening right then and there, like parking.
Certainly.
Also Christ, and also things that are going to happen in the future.
Yeah.
You know, without having to be specific on any one of them. Just the idea is that, hey, this is going to happen. If you try to make more out of it than you making out of it, then you're going too far.
Okay.
But something's going to happen.
There's a point well taken there, in that God did not give them explicit details in these images. What is God providing? What is Christ providing here?
An outline.
Exactly, an outline, an overall concept. These horsemen that we're seeing in these seals being opened, who are these horsemen?
Well, the first one is
the
very proper. You know,
the interpretation of them in specific detail is not so much important as the understanding that these horsemen are servants of God, not servants of Satan. And the lesson, the application is really quite simple. Whatever they symbolize and whatever they do is under God's control, and it fulfills His will. Therefore, the saints, the folks to whom John is writing at least, ought to recall what? Well, God's in control. What's going on in their world? Domitian's on the throne. They're beginning to be persecuted for their faith. The Jews who
they're looking for salvation.
The Jews who had been looking for a Messiah for hundreds of years have rejected their Messiah, and they've been disinherited as God's people. Their nation and their temple have been obliterated, basically, and yet they won't give up their resentment against the Christians, all because the Christians have incorporated Gentiles into the kingdom. The saints need to recall God is in control. Regardless of what happens to them, regardless of what seems to be going on in the world, no matter how dark and gloomy and hopeless and despairing their immediate circumstances might appear, there's more to life than this. This life, this existence, these hardships, these difficulties, that's not all there is. Go back to chapters 4 and 5. What's the key thought there? Key word? Perspective. That's what this is all about. So we see this white horse and the rider with a bow and a crown, and he comes conquering and to conquer. Well, let's talk about that for a minute. Conquering, conquest. In some contexts, it's the lust of humanity, the lust of man, desiring downfall of our foes, our enemies, wanting to be vindicated, maybe, or wanting to conquer and control. We've been oppressed. Now we want our time in the sun. All of this sort of thing. But here, what color is associated with this? White.
Pure.
Purity, victory. Yeah, there you go. In the context of these people, these Christians in the first century, what does a white horse in their experience and their knowledge base, what does that represent? Well, Brother West in his writing points out this is the mount of a victorious Roman general or Roman conqueror. When a Roman emperor or a Roman general serving an emperor went out to battle on behalf of the empire or the kingdom, the republic before that, or even the kingdom before that, remember Rome's roots go back to the days of Isaiah. Rome was a kingdom from the 8th century BC down to about the 5th century BC when they bump into the Greeks and begin to be familiar with them, and then they become a republic. And it's not until we get to the 1st century BC that they have been torn by internal strife and disagreement. And we have Antony and Cleopatra and all of these guys, Cassius and Brutus and Julius, who becomes Caesar in practice, if not in name. And now they become an empire. They're going to last another 500 years as an empire. When a conqueror, a victorious general, comes home with all the spoils of war and captives and the peace treaty and submission to Rome and so forth, they give him a triumphant parade, and they parade him through the streets, and they sing his praises, and they lead his captives, and they show off the spoils that he's brought home. And how does he go? Well, he either rides a white horse or he rides in a chariot drawn by white horses. He's the victor. Praise him. Well, here we've got a rider on a white horse. The imagery to these people would be a conquering hero. He's got a bow. What's a bow? A bow is a weapon. Now, West points out that if we're going to make an immediate application for these 1st century Christians, the Parthians, people to the east, were impinging on Rome's borders and causing Rome problems, demonstrating that Rome was not the all-conquering, world-beating power in every circumstance. And what was the trademark of the Parthians? Their cavalry.
Ride on.
They rode horses, and they used bows, and they shot their bows while they rode on horses and all of this. And the Romans, West says that the Romans never mastered cavalry, and that much is true, but it's not that they did not use cavalry. In fact, the average Roman legion numbered about 6,000 foot soldiers and roughly between 600 and 1,000 cavalry. So the Romans did have cavalry, and they hired cavalry from their subjugated nations. But the statement that West makes, they never mastered the use of cavalry, that's true. They were defeated more than once in battle by the Parthians and others who did have a masterful understanding of how to use cavalry. The Romans tended to excel on foot with infantry, massed infantry. They tended to conquer by overwhelming power. So you've got the color of victory, you've got the symbol of military power, military might, and then you've got a crown. And this is the Stephanos, the victor's crown, the winner's wreath, not a diadem, not a royal crown here. The bow and the crown were characteristics that were notable for the Parthians. That may be an application that we could make here. Now, let's look at an alternative interpretation here, and that would take us over to chapter 19. Flip over to Revelation chapter 19 for just a moment, and notice in chapter 19, as we go along, we come down to verses. Well, start at verse 9. The angel said to me, "Write this: Blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb." And he said to me, "These are the true words of God." Then I fell down at his feet to worship him, but he said to me, "You must not do that. I am a fellow servant with you and your brothers who hold to the testimony of Jesus. Worship God, for the spirit of Jesus, the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy." You look at verse 11 then. "Then I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes are like a flame of fire. On his head are many diadems, and he has a name written that no one knows but himself." So there we see the royal crown, but the image there is unquestionably of the Christ. Well, bring that back here. What alternative application might we make? Some would say, well, this is an image of the spread or the propagation of the gospel, the preaching of the gospel. White would represent, in that case, not so much victory, but the purity of the message. And the conquest would be the conquering of men's hearts, as it were. Now, the crown, victory over Satan, over sin, over self, by the application of the gospel. Does that fit? It makes sense, but look at the people who first received this letter. They're oppressed. They're entering, if not already in, tribulation. And who are they? They are Christians. So they've already been conquered, in a sense, conquered by Christ. They've already submitted. They're already a part of all of this. If we make this, if we take this image and apply this to preaching of the gospel, rather than the concept of conquest, victorious rule, and so forth by the Savior over all things, then we're backing off from the contextually what would be the natural understanding of this imagery. And then too, if we draw in and try to make this, oh, well, this is the preaching of the gospel and the purifying of men's hearts and so on and so forth. Okay, what are you going to do with the red horse and the black horse and pale horse? How are you going to relate that in the same way? And it very quickly becomes much more complicated to try to do that. Well, continue on. Verses 3 and 4, he opened the second seal, and I heard the second living creature say, "Come!" And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people should slay one another. And he was given a great sword. And that great sword, in this case, is the Machaira, which is a large knife, or what the Romans would call perhaps a thrusting sword. Now, this is not the long battle sword of the Romans. This is the short utility sword. This is the Roman legionnaire's Leatherman tool. It was the knife that he cut his bread with. It was the knife that he cut leather with. It was the knife that he used to dig in the dirt with. It was the knife that he used in close quarters combat. So it is a deadly weapon. It's about this long. It's the size of a big Bowie knife, basically. big utility tool in that respect. It's the animal used, it's the knife used to butcher sacrificial animals. Go down to verse 8 there. In verse 8, we have the rhomphaia, which is the big long two-handed sword. That's the battle sword of the Romans. So you have a comparison here. But this second seal is open. The red horse, the rider is given a sword. Notice what it says here. He was given a sword to take peace from the earth. He didn't come with it. It was given to him. What does red suggest? Well, warfare, bloodshed, violence. The imagery here is that which follows anything that creates upheaval in the world. Well, what creates upheaval? Warfare, violence,
I want what you have.
greed, desire, and so forth, lack of peace. The inhabitants of the earth slay each other here. Now, it's interesting that they should slay one another. And that word slay is the Greek word for butchery or for butchering, as in butchering a sacrifice. It's a word that appears repeatedly in the Revelation, but chapter 13 and verse 3 is the only passage where it is applied to someone who is other than a saint beyond this passage. Now, conflict, what we see here in verse 4, conflict is the consequence of the gospel, not the objective of the gospel. What does the seed of the kingdom do among people? Well, good and honest hearts, it brings forth fruit, 30, 60, 100-fold. But what about stony ground hearts or thorny ground hearts or wayside ground hearts? It doesn't bring forth fruit. And what did Jesus say about the effect of his teaching, his influence, his presence on even family relationships? I've come to set at variance family members, to divide families. That's not the goal. What is it? That's the effect. That's the result. Some will receive, some will accept, some will believe, some will not. And in some cases, that divides families. So peace is taken from the earth. The sword that's sent, that's given by Christ, is that which discerns the heart in Hebrews chapter 4. The word of God is what? Verse 12. Quick, sharp, living, powerful, sharper than any two-edged sword, pierces to the dividing asunder of soul and spirit, of joints and marrow, and discerns or measures the thoughts and intents of the heart. Which takes us back to Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount about even the thoughts are judged, even the thoughts can defile. So here you have a great sword, the means of carrying out battle, conquest, so forth. Warfare, conflict, could be persecution, follows on the heels of the preaching of the gospel. But then come to verses 5 and 6. He opened the third seal, and I heard the third living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius," or for a penny in some translations, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine. And Brother West has some interesting comments about the do not harm the oil and the wine with relation to some instructions given by Domitian that were intended to punish certain people and to reward other people about impacting the population with his actions. The black horse rider has a balance or a scale. That's the traditional, the crossbar with the chains and the two pans and so forth. The balance is a measure. Now, when everything is in balance, what do we know? Whatever's in this pan is equal in weight, at any rate, to whatever's in this pan. The measure here is a koinix. It's the English Standard Translation. A quart is actually, that's about exactly the right figure. It's about that much. And the amount here, the denarius, is a Roman coin. That's roughly speaking a day's wages. So a quart of wheat, 3 quarts of barley for a day's wages. Well, let's think about that for a second. What could you do with a quart of wheat? How big is a quart jar? What's about
16 ounces.
Yeah, it's about 8 inches tall and about 5 inches around. If that's full of dry cereal, well, you could make a couple of meals out of that, couple of 3 bowls full, maybe 4 for smaller people or little children. It's not a whole lot. Barley is a less desirable grain as far as most people are concerned. So 3 quarts of barley, well, that'd feed the whole family at least for a day or so. That's a day's wages. That's not a lot. That's a measure of, it's not quite famine rations, but it's pretty tough times. Normally in this time frame, a day's wage would have purchased a lot more than that. So the measure here is a measure of scarcity, of difficulties. Oil and wine, well, how essential for life are oil and wine? Not so much. They're not, they're luxuries rather than necessities. Now, Brother West brings out the point that in Domitian's reign, he had penalized some people by allowing their oil and their wine to be, their production of those things to be affected, while around Rome they were not to be. So that the Romans were not inconvenienced or affected in that way. What's the imagery here? It's not total famine, because there is food available. It's just you have huge inflation in prices. You have a huge imposition of suffering, of hardship, but it's not total starvation. Some would say, well, this speaks to economic discrimination against the saints. Specifically, Christians being excluded from the guilds and so forth, from practicing their trades. Now, Lydia, for example, in Acts chapter 16, what was Lydia's trade? She was a seller of purple, or in other words, she was in the rag trade, in the garment trade. She sold fabric, or at least dye for fabric. In some segments of the empire, to practice that trade, you were expected to pay dues, at least nominal dues, to the patron deity of that trade. And if you didn't, then the laws for this locality or that province, you were not allowed to practice your trade unless you paid your dues. I don't want to make too much out of it. It's not an exact parallel, but it would be a little bit like being prohibited from working unless you belong to this or that specific union. You're not allowed to do that. Now, in the United States, you can work non-union if you want to. You may have a hard time in some locales doing that, but you're free to do what you want in this country. There are places in the world where you're not allowed to practice your trade unless you purchase the right to do that in essence, unless you actually have paid your dues, so to speak. Well, that's comparable in some respects to what's going on here, if that's the application we make of this. Now, all of the products here are agricultural products: wheat, barley, oil, wine. They're not all scarce.
You know, but
Do what?
it makes for a skimpy meal.
Yeah, exactly. It would make for hardship. Now, is this hardship deliberately imposed on the saints? That could be. And we know that there were periods and places in the empire. It was not uniform across the empire, but there were places in the empire, particularly in Asia Minor, where those kinds of restrictions were enforced against Christians historically.
Yeah, because see, you can make bread from the wheat. Won't be any yeast or leaven in it.
Right.
Oil will go with that and to help make it soft and chewable. Wine for a drink. Barley, I don't know. You can make.
Well, you can make coarse bread out of barley.
Yes, right.
Actually, nowadays you make bread out of barley, you pay extra for it because it's one of those elite grains now.
Yeah, now.
In this country. Now you go elsewhere in the world, it's still a poor man's meal, but in this country, it's an elite grain. It's full grain.
So
sort of
in
thing.
terms of meat or anything else, that's on you, I guess. We have to go out there and hunt that.
Yeah. The point here is that in these images, what we're seeing is hardship, difficulty, distress, imagery of an unsettled, upset world. Well, what should that emphasize or remind these Christians about? What should it emphasize to them? This world is not my home. I'm just passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond blue. No matter how dark, how grim, how dreary, how hopeless life here may look, what do I need to remember? God is on his throne, and God is in control. And he has taken care of all of these things. He will take care of me. It is 11 minutes past 7, so we're 11 minutes late to take a little break. Let's take about a 10-minute break here, and we'll come back and open some more seals. Questions, comments, thoughts before we do?
Just a question about the black horse and a pair of scales. I thought the scales always meant judgment. Is that not?
Scales can represent judgment.
Okay.
Not necessarily, but they can. Other thoughts, other questions? Okay, we'll take about a 10-minute break. Okay, let's get started again. And let's look at the pale horse. It has nothing to do with Clint Eastwood, Pale Rider. But here in verses 7 and 8 now, he opened the fourth seal, and I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. And they were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword, and with famine, and with pestilence, and by wild beasts of the earth. Now, pale here is the Greek word chloros, which has to do with we get chlorine and chloroform and all that sort of thing. It describes kind of a yellowish green, sickly, pukey color. If not to be too disgusting about it, but when a person dies, their color changes. And I'm not talking about deterioration of the body over time or anything like that.
What color is he changing?
But when someone dies, they change. The appearance, the color And it doesn't matter if you're black or white or Asian or Caucasian or what have you, the appearance changes. And that's the imagery here. Now, it's interesting that this is the only rider who's named. His name is Death. He's given limited authority in verse 8, but he's given authority. Hades follows after him. Now, his name is Death, and Hades followed him. His name is not Death and Hades. The rider's name is Death. Hades follows him. What's Hades? King James Version says hell. That's a mistranslation in the King James Version in this case. Unfortunate aspect of the King James is it tends to put hell in every passage, regardless of whether it's Tartarus or Hades or any other such word. It uses hell uniformly, and that's not actually accurate. Hades is the realm of the dead in most contexts. It's where disembodied spirits go. Hades is death's companion. When you die, think about Luke 19 and the rich man and Lazarus. They died. Okay, the body is no longer animated. Very probably what happened to the rich man's body. Mourners were hired and a funeral was held, and the body was taken and entombed in an ornate crypt somewhere. What about Lazarus? Who was Lazarus? He's a beggar. He's a nobody. What would have become of Lazarus's body, assuming that they live in Jerusalem?
And thrown on the fire.
Probably, no, not Golgotha. More likely, his body was taken and unceremoniously dumped over into the valley of Hinnom, Gehenna Valley, the city dump. He didn't have a cemetery plot. He didn't have a tomb in which to, there, maybe he would have been buried in the potter's field, but very possibly just disposed of like so much garbage. After all, what do we know about Lazarus in life? He was not just a beggar, he was a sick beggar, and he had sores. He would have been unclean as far as most people were concerned, so that they don't want to have any more to do with handling him than they have to. Just scoop him up and dispose of him. He's a nobody, doesn't matter. Well, here, Hades, where both the rich man and Lazarus awake, Hades is personified. Hades follows death. Well, that does make that there's a logical connection there. When people die, what happens? The body deteriorates, the body goes back to dust, and the spirit is bound for a meeting with God. But notice, he's given authority over the earth to kill, but only over 25%. There's a limitation. Not everybody, not everything. A limitation. 4 methods of killing. This battle sword, the rhomphaia, the Roman battle sword, the Roman rhomphaia actually traces back to a Greek javelin, which is, we think of a javelin, in the Olympic games and in track and field events. What's a javelin? Well, it doesn't have a spearhead on it anymore, but it's just a long pointed stick that you throw. The Thracian javelin, or rhomphaia, had a handle or a haft between 3 and 4 feet long. And then it had a blade, not a spear point, but actually a blade on the end of it that would have been anywhere from 2 to 3 feet long. You could thrust with it, you could cut with it, you could slice and whatnot at some distance. It was a tremendous, very much a two-handed weapon. Well, the Roman implementation of that, there's more blade, less handle. We tend to think of the image that comes to mind for most people is the Crusaders' sword, the big two-handed sword of the knights with the big cross piece and so forth. That's not actually a very accurate image for the Romans, but it was a weapon of approximately that size. It was 4 feet long, roughly speaking, maybe a little more. So some are going to be slain with a sword. Famine, starvation. Well, what causes famine in much of the world? It's not just crop failure. It's not just bad weather or hail or no rain or whatnot. What else causes famine? Insects and so forth. How about war? You go through somewhere and kill 25% of the people. That's a pretty devastating casualty count in war, isn't it? Famine is naturally going to follow after that. It's ironic that in the modern world, the Russians have invaded Ukraine and done such dramatic devastation to the nation, because where, prior to all of this, did much of Russia's grain come from? Ukraine.
With the world.
Agriculturally, Ukraine was the breadbasket, not just of all of Eastern Europe and Russia, but much of Africa as well. And with war going on, I mean, there's still farmers trying to farm their fields there, guys that are not part of the Ukrainian army. But with war going on, you've got people going hungry, not just in Ukraine, but in Russia and parts of Africa and Eastern Europe as well, because of all of that.
Well, one of the things I teach students when I'm teaching class is that when the Israelites came into the land of Canaan, it was a land of milk and honey.
Oh yeah.
It was grasslands, it was trees.
Yeah.
It was a fertile place. In fact, you can read about lions, tigers, and bear. Well, no, but
lions and bears, if not tigers. Yeah.
And it was a fertile place. And
very much.
And because the Israelites did not obey God, God punished the land. You look at it now, you never thought that there was a fertile land.
Well, what was it Golda Meir said about that territory nowadays? That, you know, this is the only part of this whole section of the world that's not sitting on a sea of oil, amongst other things. And what did the Israelis manage to accomplish when they went back after 1948 and started to develop that territory? When you put water on it, man, it grows like crazy, but not many ready sources of water over there. In fact, the modern Israelis tend to lead the world in desalinization projects, because what's their most ready source of water?
Jordan,
Well, you got the Jordan River and the Dead Sea, but the Dead Sea's full of salt, saltier than any ocean. And beyond that, you got the Mediterranean Ocean out here, but it's salt water. You got to desalinate it to make any practical use of it. So one other thing about a land flowing with milk and honey, when the Israelites, who are not Israelis are not Israelites. Israelites are not Israelis. Two different groups of people. When the Israelites went in and took the land, not only is it a fertile land, but what did God say? You're going to live in houses you didn't build. You're going to harvest fields you didn't plant. You're going to glean vineyards that you didn't tend. You're going to make oil from olive orchards that you didn't prune and nurture and so forth. In other words, God didn't send them into just a fertile but undeveloped land. He sent them into a fertile, vibrant place that was already full of crops, ready to be taken over and harvested and propagated and so forth. So it was already a well-developed land in that respect, grasslands and farms and fields and so forth. But you misbehave and it's not going to stay that way. Well, guess what? It didn't stay that way. So this fourth seal, the rider, death, and Hades, fourth part, a limit. Kill with the sword, kill with famine, kill with pestilence or disease. Think cholera. What happens in the wake of battle oftentimes? Cholera and disease. Why? The infrastructure is destroyed. Sanitation is minimized. What happens to fresh water sources when they're surrounded by death and devastation? Throw a dead body in the freshest spring. Who wants to drink out of that now? And it's not long till that starts to decompose, and now you've got cholera and all sorts of things contaminating what otherwise is essential for life. And then wild beasts, wild animals on top of all of that. Ray mentioned lions and bears in Israel, and the modern perspective is, oh, there's no such thing like that there. And that's 100% true. There are no lions, there are no bears in modern Israel, in modern Palestine, in that whole part of the world now. But go back 2,000 years, go back 1,800 years, and yes, the Asiatic lion did roam that part of the world. And we have stelae or monuments that date back even to the Assyrian times of Assyrian emperors hunting Asiatic lions. The difference between the Asiatic and the African lion, about 100 pounds in weight and size. The Asiatic lion is smaller, just like the Asian elephant is a smaller eared and smaller in stature version of the African elephant. They're also much more tractable and easily trained than African elephants. But those things were present in ancient times. They were hunted to extinction between then and now. Just because they're not there now doesn't mean they weren't there then. So death and Hades, this pale rider. What do we have here? What does this symbolize? Well, it certainly could be interpreted as pestilence in a generic sense. That is, it follows all of the destruction of war and conflict and suffering and so forth. Some might also see this as divine retribution on those who persecute the saints. Certainly, this comes from God. Which one of us can control this? We can't even manage a peaceful world in our own right, can we? So that brings us then to the opening of the fifth seal. Now, before we get to that, just notice here that, well, this is the fifth seal. When he opened the fifth seal, verse 9, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. They cried out with a loud voice, O sovereign Lord, English Standard Version, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? Then they were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were to be killed as they themselves had been. So, these were slain, butchered as it were, for the same reason that John had been exiled to Patmos. Go back to chapter 1. Why had John been exiled to the island of Patmos by the Roman authorities? For the testimony of Jesus, for the preaching of the gospel. These were slain for the same reason. How long until you judge and avenge? Here is, in this fifth seal, here's not the theme of the book, but the central question of the lives, the existence of those Christians in John's time who are facing and experiencing persecution for their faith. How long does this have to go on, Lord? How long are we going to be challenged for being faithful to you. How long until you vindicate us, Lord? You have a pivotal thought here in this passage. Now, look at the imagery here. You've got the souls of the saints. Now, the first four seals present to us images of some kind of judgment, the means of judgment, the execution or the carrying out of judgment. Now we get to why. Why are we seeing all these images of judgment? Here's why. Because God's people, God's faithful ones, have fulfilled the instruction that the saints at Smyrna received. Be faithful unto death. They have been faithful even though it has cost them their lives. Now, as we look at this, what do we see? They're under the altar, and blood is under the altar. Now, in Levitical sacrifices, the blood was poured out at the base of the altar. You go back to Leviticus chapter 4 and verse 7, and Moses, when he offers sacrifice, when Aaron is to offer a sacrifice, when Moses is consecrating Aaron and so forth, you take the sacrifice, you slay the sacrifice, you put, in some circumstances, you put blood on the forehead and on the right thumb and on the right big toe and so forth, and you sprinkle some on the altar, and then you pour out the blood at the base of the altar. Here, the souls and the blood under the altar. Well, these are folks who have been sacrificed for Christ. Go back over to 2 Timothy chapter 4 for a minute, and just notice in 2 Timothy chapter 4 at verse 6, the Apostle Paul is writing, and he says at verse 6, I am already being offered. The English Standard Version says, I'm already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand. I'm already in the process of being sacrificed, you might say. Well, where is Paul when he's writing this letter to Timothy? Go ahead, David.
Honorary was just in a car accident right over here on Columbia Drive. One of our members.
Okay, well, you Honorary, that's a sister?
A brother.
A brother. Okay, well,
Try to go see if I can
you
get him.
you go take care of that.
Hey, Gene,
His wife called me. Yeah, his wife just called me. She said.
For those of you online, David Cameron, David Freeman rather, just received a phone call.
I'm calling. He not answering.
That, a brother from Avondale named Honoré has just been involved in an automobile accident nearby, and he's going to go and check on him. So I'm sure he'll have word for you shortly after this. So do keep Honoré and what's her name? His wife,
Christy.
Christy. Do keep them in your prayers.
Chris Ryan is very sick. He's a very sick person.
Okay. Well, David's going to go and check, and I'm sure word will get back to you shortly. So keep them in your prayers. These are folks in this fifth seal. The saints here are those who have been sacrificed for the cause of Christ, just like Paul was describing in 2 Timothy chapter 4. Paul, at the time that he's writing to Timothy, is a Roman prisoner. This seemingly is his second time of imprisonment in Rome, and he is seemingly under a death sentence, going to be executed. Of course, in Paul's case, as a Roman citizen, he would be beheaded, not crucified. But regardless, why is he even under condemnation? For the testimony of Jesus, for preaching the gospel. Parallel to John in chapter 1 and to Paul in 2 Timothy chapter 4, it is very, very plain, very, very vivid. These are those who were slain or offered for the word of God because of their testimony. Flip over to Revelation chapter 12 for just a moment, and notice there in Revelation 12, pages will separate, and verse 7, In Revelation 12 and verse 7, the testimony of Jesus here is mentioned. We read there in the image of the war in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon and his angels fought back. You continue down through here and come to verse 17 in Revelation chapter 12. Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who do what? Keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. So you have opposition to those who are faithful to the Lord. So here we have a first glimpse of them, those martyred for the cause of Christ. How long? Now, speculation is that these are martyrs of Domitian's reign. And you go back to chapter 2 and verse 13. Some of you will be put to death and others imprisoned and so forth. That may be. Some of these might have been from Nero's time, 30 years earlier. But even so, who else could have been included in this number? Go back into the Old Testament. And what do you find in the conquest of Jerusalem, for example, by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC? You've got King Zedekiah, the spineless evil king who's captured and blinded and sent into captivity. But what about all of the people defending Jerusalem? Well, the soldiers and the rebels that are aligned with Zedekiah, they get what they deserve. What about the women and the children that suffer innocently? More than that, we know that Jeremiah is spared and his servant as well, whose name escapes me. But do we read of the destruction of Jerusalem and think every single solitary Jew there was an unrepentant, ungodly, unrighteous person? What about the Jews living in the outlying cities that are swept up in this battle and sold off into slavery into Babylon? Not all of them were unrighteous. Some of those who suffered, some of those who were captured, some of those who died would have been righteous. Their faith qualifies them to be among the righteous, not the unrighteous. Go back into more ancient times, to the days of the judges oppressing Israel. Is everyone who was oppressed an unrighteous person in Israel? No. Here, the imagery, we tend to think, and naturally so, logically so, understandingly so, or understandably so, we think of Christians, and undoubtedly the folks in the first century would be thinking of their brethren being persecuted and executed for the faith. But they're not the only ones who have been faithful. And so those under the altar may even include those martyrs of ancient times whose testimony was their faithfulness to, from their perspective, a yet to come Messiah. They're still going to be faithful to God. Well, the question, how long until you avenge us? Until you judge and avenge us? You look here, how long until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? Well, the words judge and avenge here in verse 10 are legal terms. It's a plea for God to vindicate these martyrs, these believers, but not to vindicate them personally. And it's not a request for personal revenge. Vindicate their faith. Vindicate God's cause. Now there's an interesting little sidelight here as well. What do we see about these who have been martyred for the cause of Jesus? What's their condition? Well, we see them under the throne, or under the altar rather. But what are they doing? They're pleading, they're appealing,
They're also waiting for God to act.
they're waiting. But while they're waiting, while they're pleading, while they're appealing for justice, for vindication, for God to vindicate himself, they're conscious. They're not just conscious, they're conscious and they're alert. And they're not just conscious and alert, they're conscious and they're alert and they're remembering, even though they're dead. Now, to those folks like the Jehovah's Witnesses, or like Edward Fudge and some among the fringes, even of some of our own brethren, not to mention much of Protestantism nowadays, that fact flies in the face of what many of them believe. That is, that if you're not going to heaven when you die, well, you just go into oblivion. You're just asleep, peacefully oblivious to everything. These folks are not oblivious.
That policy called annihilism.
Well, annihilationism, the idea that you just no longer exist. God just wipes you out, not in any painful, suffering kind of way, but just like turning off a light switch. You know, reach over here, flip the switch, no more light. Well, that idea flies in the face of what we see here. Now, granted, what are we looking at? What is John seeing?
This is a vision.
This is a vision. This is an image. But everything else that John has seen corresponds in some respects to reality. Now, the imagery, the four living beasts, four living creatures, and so forth, those are not anything that exists in this world. But he sees them as real, authentic, legitimate. They have meaning, they have purpose. Why would this be any different? Well, avenge us on those who dwell on the earth. Those who are unrighteous, those who are ungodly, still living in this world. Now, in that context, who would these people be thinking of? Most likely those who had unjustly shed their blood. So that brings us back to, who are we seeing here? Martyred saints. Who would the logical candidates for this? You know, I'm talking about Old Testament suffering and so forth a minute ago. For the readers that received John's letter, who would the logical folks that they would picture be?
Romans.
Their own brethren that had been slain by Romans, and perhaps at the behest of some of the Jews or the pagans that hated them for their faithfulness. Those who had persecuted them. Those who had shed their blood. But go on. Notice here the outcome of this. They were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer. Well, in this context, what would white represent? We think of purity, but and that's a legitimate concept. But just like John over here holding up the V for victory sign, which shows his age, because you know some of us grew up, oh, that's peace, man. But victory over Satan and sin and self and persecution and trial and so forth. Victory over the challenges and the trials and the God of this world. Victory in eternal things. Rest a little longer, for a little time. What's the message? Well, God will vindicate himself. Justice is coming, but not just yet. Why not? Why not now? God's not finished. Just keep reading there at verse 11. Until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were to be killed as they themselves had been. That's from a present living in this world perspective. Well, that's kind of cold comfort, isn't it? Whoa, wait a minute. You mean there are going to be more martyrs? This is not fixing to be over yet. Nope, not yet. God does not give an explicit, specific answer to their question, does he?
Sure he does.
God
A little
keeps
while.
God keeps his own time. How long is a little while? God keeps his
A
own
day is
timetable.
like 8,000 years.
Yeah.
So, you know.
Exactly. God keeps his own timetable. There is
For
no,
God, it's a little while.
there you go. From God's perspective, any time is a little while. He sees the end from the beginning. It's not a problem for him. Be patient. Wait a little longer.
And that is, wait a little longer, and we're talking about first century Christians. What century are we now? 21st. So it's, 2,000 years. Blink of an eye.
Yeah. What's 2,000 years to the Lord? It's he who exists outside of time. It's not a problem. Think about this. What is time?
Whatever God created.
Time is a convenience, if you will, created by God for us. God's not limited. There's no passage of time with God. When Moses asked, who am I supposed to say sent me? What did God say? I am. God does not exist past, present, and future in a sense. I know Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, yea, and forever. But what that expresses is the same concept as I am. Perpetual present. God always is. So it's not a problem for him. I want to come back next week and draw this a little more together. Our time is about up. We really don't have time to tilt on over into the sixth seal. I had thought we'd at least finish chapter 6, but we're not far from it. Just notice in verses 12 through 17, here's God's answer in a sense
Great.
to the appeal of those saints under the altar, those saints that are martyred. Here's what's coming. Well, it's not here yet from their perspective, but it's coming. Now, Brother Taylor, let me just throw this out. Brother Robert Taylor interpreted these verses 12 through 17 as God's judgment against imperial Rome, against the Roman Empire. Well, that is a reasonable interpretation. That's a relatively logical interpretation. How long did God's judgment against the Roman Empire take, if that's the case?
It was quite some time. It's like almost 1,600 years.
Yeah, well, it's going to take from the end of the first century until the fall of Rome. It's going to take close to another 500 years. I mean, Rome is going to decline and decline and reduce in power, and the border's going to be drawn in, and the Goths and the Visigoths and the various ones are going to nibble around the edges and so forth. But
Well, how about the eastern part of Empire?
well, and then that we have the Roman kingdom and the Roman Republic and the Roman political empire. And that's going to give way after Constantine to what eventually becomes the Holy Roman Empire, which politically is not really connected to the Roman Empire at all. Charlemagne and so forth. Charles the Great. That's connected to Catholicism, the rise of Catholicism post 7th and 8th centuries AD. And then you've got the Eastern Orthodox, the rise in the Eastern Europe area and so forth of so-called Orthodox Christendom. There's a there's a break in between those two, even though they tried to make a connection back to that. But the point, God tells these saints, wait a little longer. If Brother Taylor, for example, is correct that this anticipates God's judgment against the Roman Empire specifically, well, they really do have a little longer to wait, because God, in carrying out judgment, if the fall of the Roman Empire is judgment from God, well, God took another 400 to 500 years to complete that judgment, and it was a kind of a slow piecemeal process, as it were. We'll come back and look at that a little bit more next time, and then we'll look at the opening of the seventh seal and so forth in chapter 8. We'll look at chapter 7 and 8. We'll finish by 2025 anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not actually as far behind as it might appear.
excited.
There's just a lot here. It's fun. I enjoy this. Questions, comments, thoughts, folks online? Do keep our brother in your prayers. Thank you for being here, and we'll pick up here next week, God willing.
Good night.